"Don't wrinkle my dress with your poverty," my daughter said as she stepped away from my arms in the middle of a crowded ballroom, and for a moment, every crystal chandelier above us seemed to stop shining. The string quartet kept playing softly somewhere behind me, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat echoing inside my chest. I stood there with my hands still slightly raised, frozen in front of people wearing silk gowns, tailored tuxedos, and diamond watches worth more than my old apartment building back in Milwaukee. Claire adjusted the shoulder of her cream-colored designer dress as if my touch alone might stain it. Then she smiled politely at the wealthy donors surrounding her, pretending nothing uncomfortable had just happened. A few people looked away. Others stared at me with that careful expression Americans use when they witness something cruel but don't want to get involved. I lowered my arms slowly and forced myself to smile back at her. "Of course, sweetheart," I said quietly. "Wouldn't want to ruin it." Claire nodded once before turning back toward a silver-haired businessman beside her. "Excuse me," she said lightly, already dismissing me from the conversation. "The catering tonight is from Manhattan, and trust me, it was worth every penny." They laughed softly together while I stood there holding the gift bag I had spent 3 weeks preparing for her charity gala. Inside it was a handwritten letter and a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. Family pearls. The kind passed down from woman to woman. Suddenly the bag felt much heavier than it had in the taxi ride over. I glanced around the ballroom, trying not to look lost. The place was beautiful in the kind of cold way expensive places often are. White orchids sat on every table. Tall candles flickered against gold-trimmed mirrors. Waiters carried trays of champagne beneath ceilings painted with delicate clouds and angels. Everything looked polished. Perfect. Untouchable. And somewhere inside all that perfection stood my daughter pretending I no longer belonged in her world. It had been almost 4 years since I had last seen Claire in person. 4 years of ignored birthday cards, unanswered voicemails, and brief holiday texts that sounded more like business emails than messages from a daughter. But when I saw her face printed on the invitation for this gala online, smiling beneath the headline "Women Who Rise Above Adversity," something inside me still hoped. I told myself maybe enough time had passed. Maybe people softened as they grew older. Maybe daughters remembered love eventually. So I spent $240 from my savings on a train ticket and a modest navy blue dress from Macy's because I wanted to look respectable when I hugged my little girl again. The little girl who once cried when I worked late shifts at the diner. The little girl who used to sleep beside me during thunderstorms because she was afraid of lightning. The little girl who once wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and whispered, "One day I'll buy you the prettiest house in the world, Mom." A waiter passed by offering champagne, but I shook my head gently. My throat felt too tight to swallow anything. Across the ballroom, cameras flashed around Claire as she posed beside a massive banner featuring her foundation's slogan, "Empowering women to rewrite their stories." I stared at those words for a long moment before looking down at my wrinkled hands. Funny thing about stories. The people who rewrite them usually erase someone first. I stayed at the gala for another 20 minutes after that. I do not know why. Maybe because mothers spend their whole lives waiting for their children to turn back around. Maybe because humiliation feels less real if you stand still long enough. I moved quietly through the ballroom, pretending to admire the decorations while people brushed past me carrying glasses of champagne and tiny desserts balanced on silver trays. Every few minutes I caught another glimpse of Claire across the room. She laughed easily with investors and television reporters, touching arms lightly, smiling like someone who had never known loneliness a single day in her life. I remembered when that same smile used to greet me through the greasy front window of Mel's diner at midnight. She would sit in booth number 7 after basketball practice doing homework while I wiped down counters and refilled coffee for truck drivers heading through Wisconsin. Sometimes she fell asleep before my shift ended, her head resting on her algebra book while snow piled against the parking lot outside. I used to carry her to the car wrapped in my winter coat because I could not afford proper heating back then and the old Ford took forever to warm up. I wonder if she remembers any of that now. Near the ballroom entrance, I noticed a tall display covered with framed photographs from Claire's career. Magazine covers. Charity campaigns. Awards. One picture showed her standing beside a senator at some event in Washington. Another showed her shaking hands with a billionaire tech founder in California. Under each photo was a short caption describing her journey. Self-made entrepreneur. Visionary leader. A woman who rose above hardship alone. That word stopped me cold. Alone. I stared at it for several seconds while voices echoed around me. Alone. As if no one stayed awake sewing hems at 2 a.m. so she could attend private school looking polished beside wealthier children. As if no one skipped meals quietly during winter so tuition checks would clear on time. As if no one sold a wedding ring in a pawn shop outside Chicago because her daughter deserved a better future than the one she inherited. A younger woman beside me smiled politely. Her story is inspiring, is it not? She asked. I looked at the photograph of Claire in her white pantsuit, chin lifted confidently toward the camera. Yes, I answered softly. Very inspiring. The woman glanced at my simple dress and practical shoes before lowering her voice slightly. Are you with the catering staff? For a second, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because there was something strangely freeing about realizing how invisible I had become. No, I said gently. I am just someone who used to know her. The woman nodded distractedly before walking away toward the dance floor. I turned back toward the display one last time. At the very bottom sat a glass donation box beneath Claire's foundation's slogan. Empowering women to rewrite their stories. I slipped my unopened gift bag quietly underneath the table beside it. The pearl earrings remained inside. So did the letter. Then I walked toward the exit alone while Manhattan rain tapped softly against the hotel windows. Outside, cold air wrapped around me immediately. Yellow taxis splashed through wet streets beneath glowing billboards and endless noise. I stood under the awning for a moment, clutching my coat tighter around my shoulders. Across the street, a giant digital screen suddenly lit up with Claire's face advertising the gala live stream. She looked elegant. Untouchable. Perfect. But for the first time that night, I noticed something else in her smile. Fear. Small. Hidden carefully beneath years of polish. The kind of fear people carry when they spend too long running away from where they came from. I took the midnight train back to Milwaukee because hotel rooms in Manhattan cost more than my first apartment ever had. The station smelled like coffee, wet newspapers, and old concrete. A young couple sat across from me sharing headphones while an exhausted businessman snored softly beside the window. Nobody noticed the older woman in the navy blue dress quietly staring at her reflection in the dark glass. I preferred it that way. Somewhere around 3 a.m, as the train rolled through Ohio beneath heavy rain clouds, I finally opened my phone and searched Claire's foundation online. I do not know what I expected to find. Maybe proof that I was overreacting. Maybe one small sign that my daughter still carried some piece of me inside her. Instead, the first article I opened felt like someone slowly pressing a knife into an old wound. Claire Whitmore rose from poverty completely alone, the interviewer wrote. Abandoned by instability early in life, she built her future through grit, discipline, and relentless ambition. I read the sentence 3 times. Abandoned. My fingers tightened around the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. I remembered sitting beside Claire's hospital bed when she got pneumonia at age 9, sleeping upright in a plastic chair for 4 nights because I could not afford to miss work and lose my waitress position. I remembered teaching myself basic accounting from library books so I could help her prepare for business school entrance exams. I remembered clipping coupons at the kitchen table while she practiced scholarship interviews in front of the microwave door because we could not afford a proper mirror. Abandoned. The word sat there glowing against the screen while rain streaked down the train window beside me. A few minutes later I found another interview. This one included photographs of Claire's penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. White marble countertops. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Paintings that probably cost more than my yearly income. In one picture she stood beside a glass bookshelf smiling confidently beneath a framed quote that read, "Never let where you come from define where you belong." I almost smiled at that because the irony felt too large for tears. Claire had spent years letting exactly that define her. Every expensive shoe. Every forced accent polished softer than the Wisconsin voice she grew up with. Every careful lie about her childhood. She was not running toward success anymore. She was running from me. By sunrise the train finally pulled into Milwaukee. The cold October air hit my face the moment I stepped onto the platform. Familiar. Honest. I walked 3 blocks to my apartment carrying the same gift bag I had brought to New York because somehow I could not leave it behind after all. The building elevator still rattled like loose change in a tin can. Mrs. Hernandez from Unit 4B waved at me while carrying groceries down the hallway. "Your trip go okay, Evelyn?" she asked warmly. I nodded automatically. "Long," I answered. Inside my apartment everything looked exactly the same as when I left. The crocheted blanket folded neatly over the couch. The small kitchen calendar still turned to October. My reading glasses resting beside unpaid electric bills near the sink. Quiet filled the rooms in the kindest way possible. No pretending. No polished smiles. No crystal chandeliers hiding ugly truths beneath expensive lighting. I hung my navy blue dress carefully back inside the closet and noticed the hem had loosened slightly near the bottom. Old stitching. My stitching. Years ago Claire used to brag to her friends that her mother could fix anything with a needle and thread. Back then she sounded proud when she said it. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and opened the gift bag slowly. The pearl earrings rested inside soft tissue paper beside the letter I had written her before the trip. I unfolded it carefully. The first line read, "No matter how much time passes, you will always be my little girl." I stared at the sentence for a very long time before quietly folding the letter closed again. Then I reached for the television remote because suddenly I wanted to see my daughter's face one more time. Not the version she sold to magazines. The real one hidden underneath all that perfection. The television interview aired 3 nights later while I sat at my kitchen table eating canned soup and buttered toast. Outside, Milwaukee wind rattled the old windows of my apartment building hard enough to make the blinds tremble softly. Claire appeared on screen wearing another elegant cream-colored outfit with gold earrings that caught the studio lights each time she turned her head. The host introduced her as one of America's most influential female philanthropists. Claire smiled modestly at the applause like she had practiced the expression hundreds of times before. Maybe she had. "Your story resonates with so many women," the host said warmly. "Especially women who came from difficult beginnings." Claire lowered her eyes carefully before answering. "I learned early that survival means relying on yourself. Nobody was coming to save me." The spoon stopped halfway to my mouth. Nobody was coming to save me. For a second I could not breathe properly. My tiny apartment suddenly felt very quiet except for the ticking kitchen clock above the refrigerator. I watched my daughter continue speaking about resilience and sacrifice while millions of viewers probably admired her honesty. The strange thing was that Claire did not even sound cruel anymore. She sounded convinced. Like after enough years repeating the same lie, she had finally accepted it as truth. The interview continued with polished stories about sleeping in cheap apartments after college and working endless hours to build her consulting firm. What she did not mention was that those apartments had been paid for partly by the extra diner shifts I picked up at age 52. She did not mention the nights I soaked my swollen feet in ice water after 14-hour shifts because her textbooks cost $600 a semester. She did not mention the winter I secretly sold Harold's old fishing boat after he died because Claire needed money for an unpaid internship in New York. Instead, she spoke elegantly about determination while soft piano music played beneath the segment. Somewhere in Manhattan, people were probably watching her with admiration. But all I could see was the little girl who used to wait for me outside school holding construction paper art projects in tiny mittened hands. Halfway through the interview, the host smiled brightly and said, "We actually uncovered something fascinating while researching your background." Claire's expression changed so slightly most viewers probably missed it. But I saw it immediately. Her shoulders stiffened. The host turned toward a large screen behind them, and suddenly an old photograph appeared for the audience. My heart nearly stopped. It was me. 30 years younger. Standing beside a sewing mannequin in a small boutique shop downtown wearing measuring tape around my neck and smiling beside a teenage Claire holding a prom dress. Many people do not know your mother was actually quite respected locally for her custom dress work, the host continued cheerfully. Some of Milwaukee's largest charity events featured gowns she designed during the 1990s. Claire blinked once. Then twice. For the first time since the interview started, she looked genuinely unsettled. "Yes," she said carefully. "My mother did some sewing work years ago." Some sewing work. I almost laughed quietly into my soup bowl. Back then women drove from Illinois and Minnesota to order dresses from my little shop because they said my stitching made them feel elegant without trying too hard. Claire used to sit on the counter after school sketching gowns while I pinned fabric hems beneath bright fluorescent lights. She loved that shop once. Loved the smell of fresh fabric and warm steam irons. Loved watching women cry happy tears when they saw themselves in the mirror wearing something beautiful I had made with my own hands. The host smiled again. "One former client described your mother as an artist." Claire nodded politely, but I saw it then. Panic. Tiny. Carefully buried beneath years of social training. Because for the first time in a very long while, her perfect story had cracked open slightly on live television. And underneath it stood the one thing she spent years trying to hide. Me. The next morning my phone rang at exactly 8:13 while I was folding laundry beside the radiator. Hardly anyone called me anymore, so the sound startled me enough that one of Harold's old flannel shirts slipped from my hands onto the floor. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering because I already knew who it was. "Hello?" Silence breathed softly through the line before Claire finally spoke. "I saw the interview replay this morning." Her voice sounded controlled in the same careful way people speak during business negotiations. Not warm. Not angry. Measured. I sat slowly on the edge of the couch. "You looked beautiful on television," I said honestly. Another silence followed. Longer this time. "You always do that," Claire replied quietly. "Do what?" "Act like nothing bothers you." I glanced toward the apartment window where gray clouds pressed low over Milwaukee rooftops. Down on the street, somebody was walking a golden retriever through puddles left by last night's rain. Ordinary life continuing like always. "That is not true," I answered. "Many things bother me." Claire exhaled softly. I could hear distant traffic behind her, muffled voices, the faint hum of city life moving around her expensive world. "The producers blindsided me with those photographs," she said. I did not approve that segment. I know. People online are already digging into my background now. There it was. Not embarrassment over what she said to me at the gala. Not regret. Fear. Carefully wrapped inside professional language. I closed my eyes. Briefly. "Claire," I asked gently, "why are you so ashamed of where you came from?" The question seemed to hit something fragile inside her because suddenly she sounded younger. Smaller somehow. "You do not understand how people in my world think." I looked around my tiny apartment at the faded curtains and secondhand furniture. No, I said softly. I suppose I do not. She became quiet again before speaking more quickly this time, words rushing together beneath years of pressure. Do you know what it was like at Princeton when people found out my mother hemmed dresses and worked in a diner? They laughed at my accent. They asked if we lived in a trailer park. One girl actually asked if you used food stamps growing up. I listened without interrupting. I spent years trying to become someone people respected, Claire continued. Every room I entered, I had to prove I belonged there. Her voice cracked slightly on the last sentence before smoothing itself back into control. For the first time in years, I heard exhaustion underneath her perfection. And somewhere along the way, I said quietly, you decided belonging meant erasing me. She did not answer immediately. The silence between us stretched long enough that I thought perhaps she had hung up. Then finally she whispered, you make it sound cruel. I looked down at the half-folded flannel shirt still lying beside my feet. Harold used to wear it every Thanksgiving while frying turkey in the driveway because he was terrified of burning down the kitchen. Claire once spilled cranberry sauce all over that shirt when she was 12 and cried for an hour because she thought her father would be angry. Instead, he laughed and told her memories mattered more than fabric. Funny how children forget the lessons that love tries hardest to teach them. Sometimes the truth sounds cruel because it is, I answered gently. Claire inhaled sharply. Then her business voice returned almost immediately like armor snapping back into place. There is a charity board luncheon next Friday in Manhattan. Some journalists will be there after the interview situation. I need this handled carefully. I frowned slightly. Handled? I think it would help if people saw us together publicly, she said. Something warm. Respectable. Respectable. The word settled heavily inside my chest. Not loving. Not healing. Respectable. Outside, the golden retriever barked happily at passing pigeons while wind scattered orange leaves across the sidewalk. I closed my eyes for one brief second before answering. I will think about it, I said quietly. Then I hung up before my daughter could turn motherhood into another performance. For the next 4 days I said nothing to anyone about Claire's invitation. I went to work at the public library on Tuesday morning like always, helping elderly patrons print insurance forms and showing college students how to use the archive computers. Quiet work. Honest work. Around lunchtime, Martha Green from Circulation handed me a cinnamon roll wrapped in napkins because she said I looked tired. I thanked her and smiled politely without explaining that emotional exhaustion settles into the body differently at 67 than it does at 25. At my age, heartbreak does not arrive like fire anymore. It arrives like winter. Slow. Silent. Heavy in the joints. That afternoon, while organizing returned books near the history section, I noticed a young woman staring at me from the end of the aisle. She looked familiar somehow. Early 30s. Dark curls tucked beneath a wool hat. Nervous eyes. Finally, she approached carefully holding a hardcover biography against her chest. Excuse me, she said softly. Are you Evelyn Carter? I nodded once. Her expression changed immediately with recognition. I knew it, she whispered. I saw the television interview. My stomach tightened slightly. I hope that was not too disappointing, I said lightly. The woman looked almost offended by the idea. Disappointing? No. You reminded me of my grandmother. She hesitated before continuing. I actually attended Claire Whitmore's gala last week. My company sponsored one of the tables. I kept sliding books onto the shelf one at a time while listening quietly. When I saw what happened near the ballroom entrance, she stopped herself awkwardly. I am sorry. I probably should not mention it. But she already had. And somehow hearing a stranger acknowledge it out loud hurt differently than living through it. More real. Less dismissible. I placed another book carefully into its place before answering. People say unfortunate things sometimes. The young woman shook her head slowly. No. People reveal themselves sometimes. Her words followed me long after she left the library that evening. Back home, I made grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner and sat by the apartment window watching snow begin to fall lightly across Milwaukee streets weeks earlier than usual. Tiny white flakes drifted beneath yellow streetlights while passing cars hissed over wet pavement below. I thought about Claire as a child again because motherhood has a cruel habit of preserving old versions of people long after they disappear. I remembered one winter when she was 8 years old and embarrassed because her coat came from a thrift store. Another girl at school laughed at the faded zipper. Claire cried the entire bus ride home. That night I stayed awake until 2 in the morning sewing small pearl buttons along the collar to make the coat look elegant and new. The next morning Claire spun in front of the hallway mirror smiling proudly before school. Now nobody will know, she whispered happily. At the time I thought I was protecting her confidence. I did not realize I might also be teaching her that appearances mattered more than truth. Around 9:30 my phone buzzed again. This time a text message appeared instead of a call. Claire rarely texted me directly unless something benefited her schedule. The message was short. Journalists are asking questions after the interview. Friday is important. Please do not make this harder than it already is. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone face down beside my teacup. Not once had she apologized for the ballroom. Not once had she asked whether I was hurt. Everything with Claire now sounded like damage control after a public relations problem. Outside, snow continued falling quietly over parked cars and empty sidewalks. I stood and walked toward the hallway closet where old storage boxes sat stacked neatly beside. Winter blankets. Slowly I pulled down the smallest box and opened it carefully on the kitchen table. Inside rested dozens of letters tied together with blue ribbon. Letters Claire wrote me during college. Before Manhattan polished her into someone unrecognizable. Before success taught her to fear ordinary people. I touched the ribbon gently with my fingertips while the apartment clock ticked softly nearby. Then I untied it. I spent nearly 3 hours reading those letters at my kitchen table while snow gathered quietly outside the apartment windows. The paper smelled faintly old and dusty, softened at the folds from years of being opened and reread during lonelier seasons of my life. Some letters were written on cheap notebook paper covered in frantic blue ink from college exam weeks. Others came on elegant stationery after Claire graduated and moved to New York. I read every single one slowly. In one letter she wrote about crying in a campus bathroom because wealthy students mocked her department store shoes. In another she admitted skipping meals to save money while pretending she had already eaten with classmates. But one sentence stopped me completely. It appeared halfway through a letter dated October 14, 1998. I am terrified that if successful people ever meet us, they will see exactly where I came from and laugh at me forever. I read the line again and again while the apartment clock ticked softly beside me. There it was. Not cruelty exactly. Fear. Small at first. Embarrassed. Human. But fear left alone long enough has a way of hardening into something colder. Something sharp enough to cut the people who once protected you. Around noon the next day, I made coffee and called Claire back for the first time since her invitation. She answered immediately like she had been waiting beside the phone. So, she asked without greeting. I looked down at the old letters spread across my kitchen table. I will come to the luncheon. Relief moved through her silence so clearly I could almost hear her shoulders loosen. Good, she said quickly. This can help settle things down. Settle things down. As if our relationship were a spilled drink. At one of her fundraising events. Claire, I asked quietly, do you remember the blue winter coat with pearl buttons? Silence. Then softer this time, what? When you were 8 years old. The thrift store coat. Another pause followed. Longer. More fragile somehow. I remember, she admitted carefully. I smiled sadly at the memory. You told me nobody would laugh at you anymore because it looked expensive. Claire exhaled slowly. Mom, I should have taught you then that being loved mattered more than being admired. Her voice sharpened defensively almost immediately. You think this is all because I wanted nice things? No, I answered gently. I think somewhere along the way you started believing poverty was shameful instead of temporary. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then finally she said, quieter now, you do not know what it is like in my world. I stared around my tiny kitchen again. The old magnets on the refrigerator. Harold's coffee mug still chipped near the handle. Snow melting slowly against the fire escape outside. Maybe not, I said softly. But I know what it costs you. Friday arrived gray and bitterly cold even for November. I wore a dark green wool dress and curled my silver hair carefully because dignity is sometimes the only luxury age leaves behind. The charity luncheon took place inside a private Manhattan hotel overlooking Central Park. Everything smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished marble. Women in tailored coats moved through the lobby balancing designer handbags and quiet confidence. Claire spotted me immediately near the entrance. For one brief second her expression softened into something almost like relief. Then the cameras appeared. Instantly her posture changed. Perfect again. Controlled. She walked toward me smiling carefully while reporters nearby adjusted microphones and camera lenses. Mom, she said warmly enough for everyone to hear. She leaned forward lightly, offering an air kiss beside my cheek instead of a real embrace. I noticed it immediately. So did she. Somewhere deep beneath her polished expression, embarrassment flickered across her face like a crack beneath fresh paint. Around us, people smiled approvingly at the performance. But I stood perfectly still because suddenly I understood something very clearly. Claire did not fear my poverty nearly as much as she feared the possibility that people might discover she once belonged to ordinary love. The luncheon ballroom overlooked Central Park through enormous glass windows that made the city appear softer than it really was. Snow rested lightly on tree branches below while waiters carried plates of salmon and roasted vegetables between tables covered in white linen. Wealthy donors spoke quietly about investments, non-profit boards, and holiday trips to Aspen as though the entire world existed inside polished conversations and expensive watches. Claire sat beside me at the head table smiling for photographs every few minutes. Each time a camera turned toward us, her hand rested lightly near my arm. Never fully touching. Always close enough to create the image people expected. Across the room journalists watched carefully, waiting to see whether the recent interview controversy would become something larger. Claire noticed them constantly. I could tell by the tension hidden beneath her perfect posture. Halfway through lunch, the event moderator stepped onto the small stage near the windows and tapped the microphone gently. Before we conclude, she announced warmly, Miss Whitmore requested to share a few personal remarks about resilience and family. Applause filled the room while Claire rose gracefully from her chair. She looked beautiful standing beneath the chandelier lights. Controlled. Elegant. Untouchable. But I knew now that fear still lived quietly underneath all that polish. Claire began speaking smoothly about women overcoming obstacles and creating opportunities for future generations. The audience nodded along approvingly. She had always been talented with words. Even as a little girl she could talk herself out of almost any punishment with those bright blue eyes and careful sincerity. Then her voice softened slightly. Success means very little, she said, if you forget the people who shaped you. Slowly she turned toward me while cameras shifted immediately in our direction. My mother taught me the value of hard work and sacrifice. More applause followed. Around us people smiled with visible relief, grateful for the emotional reconciliation unfolding neatly in front of them. Claire looked at me carefully then, waiting for me to complete the performance beside her. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. I stood slowly from my chair. At 67, standing up gracefully in high heels takes more effort than people realize, but I managed it anyway. The moderator quickly handed me a microphone with excited eyes as though she sensed a heartwarming moment about to happen. I looked around the ballroom quietly before speaking. When Claire was 14, I began softly. She wanted a pale blue winter formal dress that cost $320. Light laughter moved through the audience. Claire blinked once, clearly unsure where I was going. At the time, I continued, that amount felt impossible for us. So after my diner shifts ended each night, I stayed awake sewing a copy by hand at our kitchen table. The room grew quieter now. I remember watching her walk into that school gymnasium believing she looked every bit as beautiful as the wealthy girls around her. Claire lowered her eyes slightly. I kept speaking calmly. No anger. No bitterness. What I did not realize then was that my daughter spent years believing beauty and acceptance only belonged to people with money. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, silverware stopped clinking against plates. That was my mistake, I said gently. I taught her how to survive embarrassment instead of teaching her there was nothing shameful about being ordinary. Claire looked up at me sharply then. Real emotion flickered across her face for the first time all afternoon. Not anger. Pain. Small and frightened beneath years of perfection. I turned toward her fully. You were never poor because we lacked money, I said quietly enough that the entire room still heard every word. You were poor the moment you started believing love could lower your value. Nobody applauded this time. The silence felt too honest for applause. Claire stared at me while cameras flashed softly around. The ballroom like distant lightning. And for the first time since Manhattan transformed her into someone polished and unreachable, my daughter looked exactly like the scared little girl wearing a thrift store coat with pearl buttons sewn carefully along the collar. The luncheon ended quietly after that. People returned to their conversations in softer voices while waiters cleared untouched dessert plates from the tables. Outside the ballroom windows, snow drifted slowly over Central Park like the city itself was trying to cover everything in silence. Claire remained beside the stage long after I sat back down. Reporters approached cautiously now, no longer hunting for scandal but something else entirely. Humanity perhaps. Vulnerability. The polished certainty she carried for years had cracked open just enough for people to glimpse the frightened woman underneath. I slipped my coat on carefully and reached for my purse because suddenly I felt very tired. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just tired in the deep way mothers become after loving someone too long without recognition. As I walked toward the ballroom exit, I noticed several women watching me differently now. Warmer somehow. One older donor touched my arm gently and whispered, "Your daughter was lucky to have you." I smiled politely without answering because some truths arrive too late to comfort anyone. The hotel lobby smelled faintly of pine decorations and expensive candles. A pianist played Christmas music softly near the entrance while wealthy guests checked coats and called drivers outside. I had almost reached the revolving doors when I heard Claire's heels crossing the marble floor quickly behind me. "Mom." Her voice stopped me immediately because for the first time in years she sounded completely unguarded. I turned slowly. Claire stood several feet away clutching her phone tightly in one hand. Without the cameras around us, she suddenly looked younger and older at the same time. Like success had exhausted her more than protected her. For a moment neither of us spoke. Snow blew lightly against the glass doors behind me while taxis moved through Manhattan traffic outside. Finally Claire looked down and whispered, "You embarrassed me today." I studied her face carefully. The expensive makeup. The careful posture. The sadness buried beneath all of it. Then quietly I asked, "Did I?" Her eyes filled slightly, though she fought the tears immediately. "People will talk now." "People always talk," I answered softly. The question is whether you still recognize yourself when they stop. Claire looked away toward the lobby Christmas tree glowing gold beside the elevators. You do not understand how hard I worked to build this life. I know exactly how hard you worked, I said gently. I was there for all of it. That seemed to break something inside her because suddenly tears slipped down her cheeks despite her effort to stop them. Not dramatic crying. Quiet tears. The kind adults hide because they no longer believe anyone will comfort them. I spent so many years trying not to feel small, she whispered. I stepped closer slowly. Sweetheart, I said, there is nothing small about where you came from. Claire covered her eyes briefly with trembling fingers. For one strange second, I saw the little girl from Wisconsin again. The child who once waited awake on our apartment couch just to hear me come home safely after late shifts. The child who used to hold my hand crossing icy parking lots in winter. Then she looked at me with all the exhaustion of someone who spent years outrunning love because she mistook it for weakness. Why did you still come today? She asked quietly. After what I said to you. I smiled sadly. Because mothers spend their lives hoping their children remember who they were before the world taught them to be afraid. Claire stared at me for several seconds before stepping forward carefully. This time there were no cameras. No donors. No reporters adjusting microphones nearby. Just a tired daughter standing beneath hotel lights while snow fell softly outside Manhattan windows. Slowly, almost uncertainly, she wrapped her arms around me. And this time, she did not care whether her dress wrinkled.